Former White House secretary arrested. Karoline exposes Joe Biden's White House scandal. The White House briefing room was unusually quiet. The podium, usually a platform for clarity or chaos, now served as the center of a constitutional storm. Karoline Leavitt stood before it not as an apologist, not as a victim, but as a whistleblower. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She was here to reveal what no one dared admit. They silenced millions of Americans on purpose. The journalist leaned forward. For 2 years, she said, the Biden administration willfully removed American Sign Language interpretation from press briefings. Not a glitch, not an oversight, a choice. The room shifted. Cameras zoomed in. Pens scratched faster. Karoline had once stood at this very podium under the Trump administration. Back then, she was mocked, maligned, and misquoted, but now she had the spotlight again, this time not to defend policy, but to expose injustice. We talk about transparency, about access. But what kind of democracy cuts off the deaf community from real-time government information? Her voice was calm, her words volcanic. Behind the scenes, Karine Jean-Pierre. President Biden's current press secretary had quietly phased out the ASL interpreters, not with public statements, not with consent, but simply not hiring them. It started small, Karoline said. Fewer interpreters, less visibility, then none at all. The justification, budget, scheduling, optics. But here's the truth. It was about control. A lawsuit had been filed by the National Association of the Deaf. Buried in its 27 pages were damning details, meetings canceled, requests, ignored emails, unreplied, a system built on exclusion. Karoline knew the press would question her motives. Why now? Why her? She anticipated it. She welcomed it. You think I'm doing this because I served in a Republican White House? Fine. I won't argue politics. I'll argue the law. ADA Title II mandates equal access to public communication. That includes ASL. Biden's team knew it. They ignored it. Screens behind her flashed excerpts from internal emails. One from a senior aide read, "Let's not make the interpreter a fixture. It distracts from the message." Karoline continued, "Imagine being told that your existence is a distraction, that your access to your government is a nuisance. That's not democracy, that's suppression." Her words struck nerves. Not only among journalists, but among millions watching the live stream, especially those long forgotten by the political elite. She pulled out a printed statement from the National Association of the Deaf. It read, "Silence is not accidental, it is engineered." The Biden administration had so far remained quiet on the lawsuit, but Karoline knew that would change. The story was picking up momentum. "This isn't about left or right," she said. "It's about right and wrong." Her mic went silent. She stepped down, but the fire had just been lit. Outside the White House gates, protesters held up signs. "Access is a right. We see you even if they don't." The national conversation had begun, and Karoline was no longer defending the administration. She was challenging it. The courtroom was more tense than ever on day 14. Karoline Leavitt sat composed at the witness stand, a single strand of blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ear. This wasn't a media briefing, and there were no prepared talking points. Today it was her word versus the political machine she once served. Her role under President Trump had been simple speak, truth no matter the cost. But now the cost is higher than ever. "Ms. Leavitt," began the prosecutor, "please describe the circumstances that led you to uncover the interpreter scandal under the Biden administration." Karoline inhaled deeply. It began with silence. She recounted the day she attended a press briefing led by Biden's press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre. A question had been asked by a journalist from a disability advocacy group. The journalist had a sign language interpreter with her, but there was no interpreter present at the podium. "I noticed it wasn't a one-off," Karoline said. "Over several weeks, press briefings stopped offering ASL interpretation. No explanation, no transition. Just gone. Emails surfaced. Internal memos. Karoline testified that during her own tenure, inclusion had been policy. That removal of such access required explicit justification. None had been given in this case. Was there any attempt to reverse the decision?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes. I wrote directly to the Office of Public Engagement. I received a generic response, something about streamlining communications and modernizing outreach. Karine Jean-Pierre's face remained unreadable. She sat with her legal counsel, fingers laced tightly. Then came the witness from the National Association of the Deaf. Dr. Bobby Beth Scoggins took the stand interpreter by her side. Her voice was clear and deliberate. What the administration did was not mere oversight. It was excluded by design. This violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. She laid out how the removal of interpreters restricted millions of citizens from accessing public information, especially during critical announcements related to healthcare, national security, and civil unrest. They turned off the microphone for an entire community. Karoline nodded in agreement. She then opened a folder and held up a stack of screenshots. Each showed federal events, COVID briefings, national emergency update speeches, all lacking sign language access. Mr. Biden promised unity and inclusion, she said, but this administration excluded the most vulnerable while pretending to serve them. The prosecutor then displayed a lawsuit. Filed by the NAD, it demanded reinstatement of ASL interpreters and alleged systematic erasure of disabled voices. Karoline's role in surfacing this violation had triggered that lawsuit. Her testimony was now key to the case. Under cross-examination, Biden's defense attorney leaned in. Ms. Levitt, isn't it true that you have a political agenda? You worked for Donald Trump. Karoline replied calmly, yes, and I'm proud of it, but this isn't about red or blue, it's about right and wrong. The courtroom murmured. The next witness, a former interpreter for the White House, testified anonymously. Her voice was distorted for safety. We were told to stop showing up. No replacement, no official memo, just silence. The administration's legal team scrambled to mitigate the fallout, but the damage was done. Then came a dramatic turn. The prosecutor played a video from a Biden staffer's leaked Zoom meeting. The transcript revealed a direct quote from a deputy communication director. If the message is tight, we don't need hands flapping beside it. It's a distraction. Gasps echoed. Karine Jean-Pierre stood to object, but the judge allowed the clip. This is relevant, the judge said. And devastating. Back on the stand, Karoline added, this isn't incompetence, it's policy dressed up as efficiency. And it's cruel, plain and simple. Public outrage grew. Journalists began publishing pieces titled Inclusion Erased the Deaf Left Behind and White House and Silent Scandal. Protests broke out outside the courthouse. Deaf activists stood holding signs with raised hands, silent but powerful. We're still here. Karoline exited the building that evening to a crowd chanting her name. One woman signed through her tears. Thank you for hearing us. Karoline signed back always. Day 14 ended with the courtroom still buzzing. But Karoline Levitt had done what she came to do, pull back the curtain on silence. And now the nation had no choice but to listen. The morning after Karoline Leavitt's searing rebuke of the Biden administration, Washington, D.C. was ablaze with reaction. Cable networks ran her podium footage on a loop. Social media split down ideological lines. Supporters praised her courage while critics accused her of grandstanding. But Karoline wasn't done. In a follow-up interview on a conservative news outlet, she made her stance even clearer. This administration isn't just inefficient, it's negligent, she declared. Karine Jean-Pierre can spin all she wants, but the American people are not blind to the crisis unfolding in real time. She called out Joe Biden, directly pointing to what she labeled the administration's deliberate disregard for constitutional accountability. Karoline's message was potent under Biden's watch. Transparency had vanished and public trust had eroded. And she had the facts to back it up. She cited the unexplained firings of several internal watchdogs, the replacement of career inspectors general with politically aligned loyalists, and most shockingly, the administration's decision to cut ASL interpreters from key public events, a move that triggered immediate legal repercussions. The National Association for the Deaf had filed a formal federal lawsuit arguing that the Biden administration violated both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. Their statement was unflinching. By silencing deaf and hard-of-hearing Americans, the White House communicated that they are second-class citizens. Karoline shared the suit's contents during a televised briefing, driving the point home. Inclusion is not optional. Equality isn't up for debate. This is more than a policy failure, it's a constitutional affront. The White House, caught off guard by the firestorm, scrambled to respond. Karine Jean-Pierre took the podium offering a lukewarm statement: "We are committed to inclusivity and regret any miscommunication." But the damage was done. Leavitt's strategic pressure had struck a nerve, and the administration's hesitance only fueled her argument. Behind the scenes, the legal case accelerated. The 25-page lawsuit laid out a disturbing timeline of discriminatory decisions. Meetings were canceled, interpreter contracts were terminated without notice, press briefings went silent for a swath of Americans. Karoline brought these points to the forefront during a panel with disability rights advocates. We're not just talking about a lawsuit, we're talking about the dignity of millions. At the same time, the economic nightmare that Karoline had warned about was now making headlines. A leaked Congressional Budget Office report revealed that Biden's proposed reconciliation bill would explode the deficit by nearly $1.2 trillion over 10 years. Several key Senate Republicans, including Ron Johnson and Susan Collins, withdrew their support. Karoline pounced. "This isn't a budget, it's a grenade, and it's been tossed straight into the wallets of hardworking Americans." The press dubbed the moment Leavitt's line, and the phrase trended for 3 days. Despite mounting pressure, Karine Jean-Pierre's defense remained thin. She repeated talking points about future savings and long-term reform, but few were convinced. Meanwhile, Karoline went viral once again. During an exchange with a CNN anchor who accused her of politicizing the deaf community's needs, she fired back, "You don't get to accuse me of politicizing inclusion when the White House is the one erasing people." The response was electric. Hashtags like Stand with Karoline and Equal Access surged. Conservative PACs began airing ads highlighting her stance. Even moderate Democrats began asking questions. Then another bombshell hit. Internal White House emails leaked by a whistleblower showed discussions about limiting interpreter services as a cost-saving measure disguised as communication restructuring. Karoline addressed the revelation with somber gravity. "What this administration calls restructuring, I call exclusion." Democratic strategists attempted damage control, but the drip of incriminating information was relentless. New data showed that ASL interpreter cuts disproportionately affected press briefings tied to immigration enforcement and economic reports issues with high public concern. Karoline emphasized the pattern: they're not just silencing disabled Americans, they're silencing the truth. Public opinion began shifting. A bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a bill requiring ASL interpreters at all federal briefings. It was dubbed Karoline's Law. Outside the Capitol, protesters, deaf and hearing alike, rallied for access. Karoline attended in person, holding a handmade sign, "Democracy includes everyone." In response, the Biden administration reluctantly reinstated ASL interpreters, but Karoline wasn't appeased. "They moved only because they were cornered," she said. "True leadership doesn't wait for lawsuits." Then came the personal fallout for Karine Jean-Pierre. A former White House staffer, protected by anonymity, filed an internal complaint alleging discriminatory communications practices. The complaint claimed that policy decisions around accessibility had been made in meetings where dissenting voices were discouraged, and that Karine had dismissed concerns by saying, "We'll circle back." As pressure mounted, Biden remained publicly silent, offering no defense of his press secretary. Karoline seized the moment. When leadership fails, accountability must rise. The media dubbed the growing scandal AccessGate. In this swirl of policy collapse, legal exposure, and public outrage, Karoline Leavitt had done what few thought possible. She'd cornered the most powerful office in the country, using nothing more than facts, conviction, and a clear moral compass. The movement she catalyzed was no longer just about ASL interpreters. It was about transparency, accountability, and the core promise of democracy that every voice matters. The White House stood visibly shaken. Every new development, every leaked email, every protest chant tightened the political noose. Karoline Leavitt had exposed more than a misstep. She had pulled back the curtain on systemic neglect. Karine Jean-Pierre, once hailed as a symbol of representation, was now the face of exclusion. Her press briefings, once polished and rehearsed, became defensive and erratic. Gone was the confident tone. In its place, clipped answers and tense exchanges. Karoline, meanwhile, sharpened her message. The American people are watching. They're tired of being ignored, tired of the spin. On Capitol Hill, the tension rippled into legislative chaos. The budget bill, already shaky, began to unravel. Senators from both parties voiced discontent. Leaked recordings revealed internal Democratic discussions admitting the interpreter cuts were politically damaging. Karoline didn't let up. She stood on the Capitol steps before the cameras. Let's be clear, this isn't about saving money. It's about silencing dissent. News broke that Karine Jean-Pierre had met privately with high-level aides to discuss a communications overhaul. Among the proposals, limiting real-time press coverage of briefings citing information mismanagement. Karoline's rebuttal was swift. What they call managing information is really censorship, and Americans won't tolerate it. Simultaneously, the federal lawsuit from the National Association for the Deaf gained traction. Multiple civil rights organizations joined the case as amicus curiae, amplifying the pressure. Karine's approval ratings plummeted. Calls for her resignation grew louder. In a closed-door meeting, Biden reportedly questioned her handling of the situation, according to a senior staffer who later resigned. Karoline capitalized on the growing cracks. This administration promised transparency. What we got was evasion. Then came the congressional hearings. Karoline was called to testify. Sitting before the Oversight Committee, she laid out the timeline, the evidence, and the consequences. I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because I had to be. Because someone needed to speak for those left unheard. The room was silent. Even her critics listened. Karine Jean-Pierre, in contrast, refused to testify, citing executive privilege. But the court of public opinion wasn't kind. As news outlets dissected Karoline's testimony, hashtags surged again. Hear every voice. Truth in translation, Karoline testifies. Fox, CNN, MSNBC, they all ran segments. Op-eds appeared in major papers. Even the Washington Post admitted Levitt has changed the conversation. Then a second whistleblower emerged, a former Office of Public Engagement staffer who confirmed that the exclusionary practices were deliberate, cost-driven, and approved by senior officials. Karoline's response, you can't put a price on constitutional rights. Protesters flooded Lafayette Square. Petitions surged past 1 million signatures demanding Karine Jean-Pierre step down. The Biden administration attempted to pivot, announcing an emergency inclusivity initiative, but the public saw it as damage control. Karoline called it a bandage over a broken bone. Her visibility skyrocketed. Networks requested interviews. Book publishers made offers. But she declined, saying, "This is bigger than me. This is about restoring trust." Her coalition grew. Disability rights groups, fiscal watchdogs, transparency activists all aligned under a single message: the people deserve better. Meanwhile, the Senate Judiciary Committee began an independent probe into the White House's conduct around accessibility compliance. Karoline submitted documentation including emails, memos, and calendar entries confirming key meetings where accessibility was stripped for optics. The probe expanded. Subpoenas followed. Karine Jean-Pierre's role as press secretary became untenable. Internal memos showed Biden advisors discussing succession plans. Karoline didn't celebrate. She warned, "It's not enough to remove one person. We need to fix the system that allowed this." And that, perhaps, was her most powerful line yet. The story was no longer just about a lawsuit or a scandal. It was about a reckoning, a demand for leadership rooted in integrity, not optics. And at the center of it, Karoline Leavitt remained unflinching. The aftermath of Karoline Leavitt's congressional testimony sent shockwaves across Washington. By morning, every major network had dissected her words. Some called her a disruptor, others a whistleblower. But none could deny the tremors she had unleashed. The White House tried damage control. President Joe Biden, visibly rattled, convened a late-night strategy meeting. Reports surfaced that internal communications had been seized for legal review. A senior aide leaked a memo titled Narrative Reclamation Strategy Phase Juntain. The title alone sent critics into a frenzy. Karoline responded during a Fox News interview, "This isn't a narrative problem, it's a real problem. The American people already know what's true." Meanwhile, Karine Jean-Pierre vanished from public briefings, replaced temporarily by Deputy Press Secretary Michael Ortiz, whose carefully chosen words only deepened suspicions. Behind the scenes, Karoline continued gathering evidence. A second lawsuit was quietly filed by another civil liberties group, this one alleging broader discrimination against disabled federal employees, citing the exclusion of interpreters as part of a pattern. Whistleblower number 2, the former OPE staffer, released a redacted version of internal budget proposals. Highlighted in red, interpreter services phase out Q2 FY23. The evidence was damning. Karoline's next move, a town hall in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Biden's hometown. The event was packed. Local residents, disability advocates, even former federal workers stood in support. "This isn't about partisan politics," Karoline said. "It's about the American promise." In D.C., the pressure mounted. The Senate Judiciary Committee scheduled open hearings on White House compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Karoline was again requested to appear. This time she came armed with more than testimony. She brought records, names, signatures. "They knew," she said before the cameras, "and they chose silence." The hearing became explosive. Senator Hawley demanded an independent investigator. Senator Klobuchar echoed the sentiment. "If this were any other administration, we'd be calling it what it is, systemic exclusion." Public reaction surged. Protesters occupied the front lawn of the White House with ASL banners reading "We Belong" and "Equal Voice Now." Then a key witness emerged. A former nurse employed by the White House medical staff testified under oath that directives had come from the highest levels to limit exposure to distracting visuals during press events. The interpreter cuts were deliberate. Karine Jean-Pierre attempted a return. A scheduled press briefing turned into a spectacle. Protesters shouted outside. Reporters asked if she would resign. She deflected. But her voice trembled. Karoline, when asked about the moment, said, "I don't want her resignation. I want accountability. There's a difference." Behind closed doors, Biden's team began crisis negotiations. Senior advisor Anita Dunn floated a reshuffling. Names were floated to replace Jean-Pierre. But Karoline warned again, "Don't treat this like a personnel issue. It's cultural. It's structural." As if on cue, leaked footage from an internal DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion workshop surfaced. A slide read, "Messaging before inclusion, manage perceptions." The backlash was instant. Even late-night comedians picked it up. One skit showed a press briefing with a mime as the only interpreter. The satire cut deep. Karoline stayed focused. She launched the Clarity Coalition, a nonpartisan watchdog group pushing for transparency, accessibility, and executive accountability. Within a week, 50,000 members had joined. Lawmakers pledged to support legislation mandating ASL access in all federal broadcasts. Meanwhile, the judiciary probe widened. Internal documents showed contracts for interpreter services had been canceled mid-cycle. Financial records revealed reallocation of funds away from accessibility toward public relations consulting. Karoline released a statement, "You can't rebrand your way out of betrayal." More damning, an internal Slack message from a senior aide to Jean-Pierre read, "Levitt is gaining ground. We need a counter-narrative." But the damage was done. A new lawsuit was filed by a deaf Marine veteran who missed critical emergency briefings due to lack of interpreters. The emotional testimony he gave to Congress was gut-wrenching. "I fought for this country. I came home and was told I didn't need to understand." Karoline stood by his side. In a televised special hosted by CNN, she explained, "The Constitution wasn't written in whispers. It demands clarity for all." The protests hadn't died down. In fact, they had grown larger, louder, more organized. What began as a series of scattered demonstrations had evolved into a movement. Across the country, Americans from all walks of life took to the streets with signs reading "Access is a right" and "Accountability for all." Karoline Levitt stood at the center of it all, no longer just a former White House secretary turned whistleblower, but now the unofficial face of executive accountability. Back in Washington, President Joe Biden summoned his senior staff to Camp David. The session was closed to the media, but leaks made their way to the press. The administration was preparing for sweeping internal reforms. The whispers of replacing Karine Jean-Pierre turned into full-blown discussions. Still, no final decisions were made. Meanwhile, the Senate launched a formal inquiry. Subpoenas were issued to current and former White House staff. One name stood out, Karine Jean-Pierre. The committee demanded her unredacted communications related to interpreter services, accessibility budgets, and internal strategy memos. Jean-Pierre retained counsel. Her public appearances ceased. Karoline, undeterred, continued her public campaign. At a rally in Atlanta, she took the stage to thunderous applause. "This is no longer about me," she said. "This is about everyone who's ever been silenced. Everyone who's ever been told their voice is too complicated, too costly, too inconvenient." New testimonies emerged. A former ASL interpreter for the Department of Health and Human Services revealed that she had been instructed not to interpret certain briefings. "Too much risk of misinterpretation," the memo had said. A class action lawsuit took shape, deaf Americans filing against the Biden administration for systemic exclusion. Legal scholars debated the implications, calling it a landmark civil rights case in the making. Inside the Beltway, the atmosphere was tense. Former allies distanced themselves from Jean-Pierre. Media outlets that once praised her began running op-eds questioning her leadership. Editorial boards urged the administration to act. Biden remained silent. The Clarity Coalition's petition for mandatory ASL interpretation in all federal communications reached 2 million signatures. It was delivered to Congress with full press coverage. Karoline's speech on the Capitol steps was broadcast live. "Silence," she said, "has never protected the vulnerable. It only shields the powerful." Inside the chamber, a bipartisan bill titled the Federal Communications Clarity Act gained traction. Drafted by senators from both parties, it sought to establish accessibility standards for every branch of federal communication. The turning point came when a federal judge ordered the release of internal recordings from West Wing strategy meetings. In one clip, a senior advisor is heard saying, "If we give in on this, we admit we ignored a civil rights issue. We're not ready to wear that." Public outrage was swift. Approval ratings dipped. Calls for Jean-Pierre's resignation intensified. Under mounting pressure, she released a carefully worded video statement. "Mistakes were made. Not out of malice, but out of misjudgment. I apologize to those who felt unseen." But Karoline wasn't satisfied. "We don't need apologies," she responded on MSNBC. "We need reform. We need consequences." The day finally came. Karine Jean-Pierre submitted her resignation. Her letter, while acknowledging the controversy, emphasized her belief in the mission of the administration and her hope that her departure would restore public trust. President Biden addressed the nation. "We must do better, and we will. Every voice matters. Every citizen counts." He signed an executive order within 24 hours mandating ASL interpreters at all official federal events and allocating emergency funds to repair the systems that had failed. Karoline watched from a quiet office inside the Clarity Coalition's new headquarters. She wasn't smiling. "This is just the beginning," she told her team. 6 months later, the Federal Communications Clarity Act passed with overwhelming support. The White House hired its first full-time accessibility director. New standards were published across federal departments. Karoline's journey from press secretary to reform leader was profiled in documentaries, podcasts, and books. But she refused to become a celebrity. At every opportunity, she redirected the spotlight. "This was never about me. It was always about who was left out." In a final scene, she returned to Scranton, a town hall in Biden's hometown, just as she had done months before. This time, the crowd included deaf Americans. The interpreter stood proudly beside her. Karoline opened with a simple sentence, "Now everyone gets to hear the truth." The audience rose in a standing ovation. The reckoning had come full circle, and the silence had finally been broken.